I'm standing on the spot where the village, the very prosperous village of Batoche once stood in Saskatchewan. And in the backdrop is the Saskatchewan Valley, with the South Saskatchewan River meanders its way down through the bottomland here. The reason Batoche became such a prosperous place was the Carleton Trail was on the other side. In the time period we're looking at, the late 1800s, Hudson Bay typically had their outposts on waterways, but the Carleton Trail had a series of outposts that they traded, and it terminated at the far side of the river here, and so a ferry was built, and thus started the village of Batoche. The reason I'm visiting this site is it is literally the last stand of Louis Riel, and I'm going to get into a wee bit of the history behind the rebellion for the Northwest, and it's both fascinating and sad. I'm sitting in one of the rifle pits that the Métis at the Battle of Batoche had built and formed in sort of a semicircle around the village. Really good defensive position, but they were armed with old trade muskets, a few repeating weapons, a few shotguns, and desperately low on ammunition. And in fact, one of the reasons the Battle of Batoche was lost because they simply ran out of ammunition. They were throwing rocks and stones. But you got to wonder what led them to this last stand. And now we get into Louis Riel and the history behind him. So who was he? He was a politician, a Canadian politician. He'd studied law and theology. He was a great orator. And he was involved in two conflicts. So the rebellion, or the Red River Rebellion of 1869, 1870, and also the Battle of Batoche in 1885. But he was certainly the founder, if you would, of the province of Manitoba, and he'd formed a provisional government there, which kind of peeved the federal government off at the time. And him and our prime minister at the time, Mackenzie, they didn't see eye to eye. They kind of butted heads a little bit. But he was able to negotiate a sort of a peaceful transfer of the province of Manitoba, which became part of the Confederacy. And we're going to wander around a bit more, and we'll get into a little bit more of his history. So who were the Métis and what were they fighting for? Well, they were a mixed breed of people, primarily indigenous people mixing with French, but also Scots, Irish, English. They had their own distinct culture, and they were residing in the Manitoba area. So after the Red River Rebellion, they're forced out of that into the area we now stand in, the Saskatchewan Valley, forming the village of Batoche. But as a historian, this is a moving spot because I'm standing in front of a mass grave where on the last day of the battle, 9 of the resistance fighters were buried in this spot. And Louis Riel, during the Red River Rebellion, I'm bouncing back and forth a bit, but he tries, convicts, and has hanged Scotty Thomas. And there's a line from a Canadian folk singer that goes, the clouds above the stockade wall were heavy with the snow, the muffled drums beat out the roll, and Thomas was laid low. After the rebellion's over, Riel realizes, well, he's in jeopardy, so off he goes to the States in exile. And he's there for a number of years. Now, while he was there, he's elected, duly elected, by the people of the new province of Manitoba as their representative of the House of Commons. So 3 terms he gets, but he never sits in his seat in Ottawa. Anyway, off I go to see more of this fascinating site and a fascinating bit of history in Canada. Absolutely beautiful backdrop for a discussion on this bit of history from Canada. So the Métis have been forced in exile, if you would, to this part of the Saskatchewan Valley. And in the meadows you see off to the back, at one time roamed millions of buffalo. But now we're 1880s, and the buffalo are all but gone. They're pretty much extinct. So a contingent is sent now down to Montana, where Riel's living, to ask him to come back and help them with their cause. And again, Riel finds himself fighting for the rights and customs of the indigenous people, where he considers indigenous the Métis culture. And he comes here, and on March the 19th, right on this spot, he forms a provisional government. Now the Canadian government is going to have no part of this. They see this as a clear sign of revolt. And we time this too with the Canadian Pacific Railroad is just about completed, so the Canadian government's able to move troops here very quickly, which they do, and the Battle of Batoche comes shortly afterwards. So Riel appoints himself as the political and spiritual leader of this new nation, for lack of a better word, and he appoints Gabriel Dumont as the military leader. Now Gabriel, he's out doing reconnaissance, and at first the Canadian government don't send in troops, they send in the Northwest Mounted Police. And he's out at a place, becomes the Battle of Duck Lake, where by chance Dumont comes in contact with him, and it's a big win for the Métis, and they rout the police. Well, then we know that this rebellion is on in full, and the troops are sent in, leading to the Battle of Batoche. So a Major General Frederick Middleton arrives. He's in command of the Northwest Field Force, they were called, and he's got a Gatling gun, he's got cannon, and as I mentioned earlier, the Métis are armed with old trade guns, trade muskets, double-barrel shotguns, and pitchforks. And the Battle of Batoche starts on May the 9th and goes for 3 days. I'm not going to get into the details. It's a complicated one. Part of it, Middleton sends a ship down the river here to land at the ferry. He's going to have a two-prong attack on Batoche. That fails. Different things fail. There's a lot of casualties on both sides, and ultimately the Métis run out of ammunition, and bedraggled Riel turns himself over to Middleton. Just an interesting part of the story, the church that we were visiting this morning, it actually survived. It's one of the original buildings in Batoche. The reason being, because normally they would fire on these, and as they took control of them, they would fire the buildings. But the priests came out and surrendered. And he basically made a deal with Middleton that if he would preserve the church, he could use it as a field hospital for his men. And that's why the church and the rectory are still standing on this site, and the only structures that remain to this day. And so now Riel, he's charged with treason. And this is where the story gets really, really sad. So the trial for Riel starts on July 20th, 1885, and his lawyer wants to argue insanity as a defense, and to some degree he was. Riel had started from a philosophical point of view, theological point of view, he started to see himself as a prophet, and he had spent some time in an asylum. Anyway, the lawyer thought that would be a good defense, but Riel would have nothing of it. And Riel is said to have made 2 very long speeches during his trial, and where he justified his actions and where he affirmed the rights of the Métis as a culture and a people. He's found guilty of treason, but one person once commented, although they tried him for treason, he was hanged for killing Scotty Thomas. So there you go. Anyway, on September 18th, 1885, Louis Riel was hanged. With the trial over, one would think that's the end of that history. However, one might say that bitterness still survives to this day. So it created havoc at the time. We had the Irish Orangemen Protestants in Ontario that strongly supported the execution, and we had the Francophones strongly opposed to it. They just saw it as another example of Anglo-Saxon dominance in the country, where it was supposed to be a bilingual, equal country, and that bitterness survives. Now, if we fast forward out of this era and into our modern times, he has been pardoned. And we now see him as being a representative for a culture that had legitimate concerns, legitimate issues. He fought for those rights, he fought for those issues, he died for those rights and issues. And he'll be remembered in Canada for a long time to come. We've got monuments for him now for this supposed traitor. And the Métis culture now in Canada are recognized as a distinct culture of people with the same benefits and rights that our other indigenous peoples have in Canada. So, and one can thank Louis Riel for that. I'm sitting here on the front veranda of the Caron house, which coincidentally is important because my friend Dennis Caron, who is in Quebec, is this amazing artisan. You've heard me talk about him before, and you've seen some of his work, like the leggings. Well, Denny hand wove this sash, and so this is the Assumption sash. And talk about timely. It is the sash, the colors, the pattern that would have been here at Batoche during that turbulent time. And if you recall, when I was in the cemetery in front of the mass grave, to show how the Métis people keep this real, keep this alive, it had about 5 or 6 hand woven, not done on looms, just like Denny does with his fingers, sashes tied to that pole that are going to weather and rot away. And it's a tribute, I guess, to the people who fought and died to maintain the culture of the of the Métis people. I find it fascinating.